Hey everyone, Mr. Taylor back here with another edition of our Anatomy Notes Distance Learning Edition. And hey, don't forget to click on that subscribe tab if you like this video. Anyway, so today we're going to start learning all about muscle tissue or muscular tissue. And this is going to get us ready for hopefully doing some dissections here when we get back to school. But we're just going to start off learning all about kind of like what muscles are made out of and how they function, and then later on we're going to learn all about their names and like what they do. All right, so muscle tissue. A few facts, few little overview things. The study of muscles is called myology. And so this is kind of like what we're going to be focusing on here in this chapter is like how much muscles work at a cellular level. Orthopedics is more the study of how bones and muscles and joints all work together to provide movement. And so that's kind of what we're going to be studying later when we're studying the different muscle groups and what they do in your body. Uh, if you look at your body, about 40 to 50% is of your body mass is made of muscles. Obviously, this depends on the person. Some of us higher, some of us lower, but they are a significant portion of the human body. And it says there's nearly 700 skeletal muscles. This is kind of a really big area of discussion because the number of skeletal muscles is really not agreed upon by all anatomists. Some people consider in some places, there's what one anatomist would consider to be one muscle, a different anatomist would consider it to be two or three muscles. So it's kind of how we decide to break them down. So that's why sometimes you might hear about like a group of muscles. For example, you might hear about like the quadriceps, and someone would consider that to be one muscle, but you could also break it down and consider it to be four different muscles. That's why it's called a quadriceps. But anyway, so we're going to learn about those later on. When we look at the different types of muscles, this is kind of a review from when we did our tissues chapter. There's three main muscle groups: smooth, also known as visceral muscle, which is your involuntary and smooth or not striated muscle, usually found inside of organs and blood vessels, things like that. You can't control it because it's involuntary, and it's very weak because it doesn't have striations. Cardiac muscle, of course, is only found in the heart. It is striated, which means it's strong. It has very regular banding of the proteins, and it is involuntary or intrinsically controlled, meaning that the heart muscle controls itself. You cannot voluntarily control it. And the one we're really going to focus on in this chapter is skeletal muscle, which is the muscle attached to the skeleton. It is the only voluntary tissue in your body, so that means that you can consciously control it. And it is striated, which means it is striped, so it is very strong. All right, so if we look at the functions of muscle in our body, it has a lot of different functions. The main function, of course, is movement. It allows you to move, not just, like moving your arms and legs, but also like moving substances around the body, like moving blood around your body. Your muscles also help you to keep your body in position. So if you think about like the back and the neck, there's a lot of muscles in there that give you your body posture. Another thing that we find is that we're able to control how much fluid is stored inside of our body through these muscles called sphincters. So, for example, there is a sphincter at the end of the urinary bladder that helps to hold urine inside of the bladder and prevents it from leaking out. Very important muscle. Another thing, like I said, moving substances. So, if we're talking about the heart, cardiac muscle, of course, pumps blood, but we can also move other substances around the body, like moving urine around the body, moving lymph, stuff like that. And finally, production of heat. As a byproduct of muscle contraction, we produce heat, which is our body heat. It's kind of like your car. If you think about how when you start up your car in the morning, it's usually pretty cold. And then once the engine gets started, it starts to heat up and produces extra heat. And if you disconnected your radiator from your car, eventually it would overheat. And your muscles are the same way. As kind of like a side effect of all the movement that happens in your muscles, they produce heat, which our body uses to stay alive. So, kind of a nice side effect. All right. So let's take a look at the histology or the tissues of muscles. And so when we look at muscles, your muscles are made of muscle tissue, but muscles also contain a lot of connective tissue, and we call this connective tissue fascia. And so the fascia is kind of like the wrapping of the muscle that holds it together and allows it to attach onto things. So this is where our tendons come from. When we look at the fascia muscles, the first layer is called the superficial, and this is, of course, the outermost layer of the muscle. And this is basically the same thing as the subcutaneous layer. So if you were to cut deep through the skin, you'd get to the subcutaneous layer. And then if you went deep to that, you would find the actual muscles. So around the outside of the muscles, we find a lot of this kind of squishy areolar tissue. We find a lot of adipose tissue. When we get to the muscle itself, we find the deep fascia that really like wrap and like become like integral to the muscle itself. And the deep fascia is made of this dense irregular connective tissue. So it's very tough and strong in all directions, and it really holds the muscle together and allows the muscle to attach onto things. There's three layers of deep fascia called the epimysium, perimysium, and the endomysium. And if this sounds familiar to you, it's because when we studied nerves, if you remember, nerves also had three layers of fascia as well, and they were called the epineurium, perineurium, and endoneurium. So it's almost the exact same setup. So as you know, epi always means on or upon, so that's the outside layer. Perimysium is going to be in the middle that surrounds these things called fascicles, which conveniently, we talked about fascicles when we studied nerves because a fascicle was a bundle of nerve cells. In this case, a fascicle is a bundle of muscle cells. And then, of course, we have the endomysium, which is the innermost layer that wraps each individual muscle fiber or cell. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a ham that you're looking at. The reason why I stuck this in here was just to kind of give you an idea about all this fascia. So when you look at a ham, this is actually a pig's leg. And in this case, you can see, there's kind of like this skin on the outside. There's this bone right here, which happens to be the femur. You can see the nice bone marrow inside. And then you can see that there's like little individual kind of like pieces of muscle. Like here's a little round muscle right here. And here's another kind of roundish muscle right over here. And in between, there's this kind of like white stuff in between that kind of separates all these different pieces apart. And here's a nice little cross section. And if you read the label down at the bottom of this, it says transverse section of round steak or ham showing. And then it lists out all the different muscles. So using this handy guide, you can actually identify all the different muscles in your ham the next time you have a ham. But what's really cool about this is that all the spaces in between, that's the fascia. So we have all that superficial fascia that kind of like wraps around the outside of the whole ham and kind of, sometimes penetrates into in between the muscles. But then each muscle, if you notice, has like little tiny like lines inside of it. And those little lines are some of that deep fascia. So let's take another look. All right, so this is a diagram from our book. And if you look at the top picture, this is looking at a whole muscle. So this is one muscle. Imagine like your biceps. So here's like the tendon of your biceps coming down. And if we look at the inside of the biceps, we see it's made up of a few different little tiny bundles. These are fascicles. So they are a bundle of muscle cells. Each fascicle is wrapped in connective tissue, and so is the entire muscle. So this epimysium, epi meaning outside, is on the outside of the muscle covering the whole thing. If we then zoom in on just one of these fascicles, here's the fascicle coming down. It is wrapped in a connective tissue called the perimysium, and then inside of that are a whole bunch of individual muscle fibers or cells, and each one of those is wrapped in endomysium. And then if you look inside of one of those individual muscle fibers, that muscle fiber is made up of a whole bunch of little tiny what are called myofibrils, which kind of looks like a pepperoni pizza. So you can see there's just like strings made of strings made of strings, and everything's all lined up together to allow the muscle to contract. This is a photomicrograph of a section of tongue, and you can see a whole bunch of different muscles going on here. But what's cool is that you can actually see all these little white spaces are actually where we find the connective tissue. So the white parts are actually the fascia, and the pink stained parts are the muscle fibers. And you can see how the muscle fibers are all bundled together into fascicles. And then you can see how there's epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium around all these different layers. All right, and that brings us on to tendons. And so basically, a tendon is where all those layers of deep fascia extend past the end of the muscle. So a tendon is just a whole bunch of dense, regular connective tissue that is going to connect a muscle onto the bone. And it's made up, like I said, of all those different deep fascia. And so what's cool about this is it means that the tendon is connecting not just the whole muscle onto a bone, but it's connecting each fascicle and each cell of that muscle onto the bone because it's made of the epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium. So literally every single part of that muscle is connected onto the bone, which makes it really hard to rip off. So that's why tendons are so strong. And then another thing we find out about muscles is that in addition to their connective tissue that they have as wrapping, they also have a lot of nervous and vascular tissue. If you've ever strained a muscle, you know that muscles have a lot of feeling. They have a lot of nerve endings. We know that we have a lot of control over our muscles. That's how we're able to do everything. So we know there's tons of nervous tissue inside of our muscles. Interesting thing to know is that there's, of course, a lot of blood flow into muscles too, in order to keep them healthy and alive and not fatiguing very easily. Interesting thing about that is that the more you use your muscles, the more vascular they become. So, if you've ever noticed that when you're out of shape, you get tired very quickly versus when you're in shape, you have more endurance. Part of that endurance is making your muscles stronger, but part of it is also increasing the vascularization and the blood flow into that muscle so that you can get more nutrients and oxygen in and you can get more waste products out. So, there you go. All right, so now let's go ahead and now we're going to zoom in even closer to these muscles and zoom in on each individual muscle fiber or cell. And so we use the word fiber instead of muscle cell because cells are not like your typical cell. They're very long, very stretched out, almost like strings. And they have kind of a roughly cylindrical shape and they're all in parallel bundles. So they all like get stuck together, one right next to another. And they form these little things called fascicles, which are bundles of muscles that we talked about before. And there could be anywhere between 10 to 100 muscle fibers in each fascicle. And then, interesting thing to mention is that if you look on the left there, it says, note the plural of fascicle is fasciculi. So, I will probably say fascicles just to make it easier. But if you see like fasciculi, fasciculus, they're talking about that's kind of like the more Latinized form of this. Anyway, so moving right along, when we look at a muscle fiber, it has a whole bunch of really specialized parts. So think back to like your introductory bio class where you had to learn about the parts of the cell. When we look at muscle cell parts, most of them start with the prefix sarco. And sarco is apparently, I believe it's Latin for flesh. And so that's where we get this from. So these are like fleshy parts. The outside part of a muscle fiber we call the sarcolemma. And the reason why it's got a special name is that it works like a cell membrane, like every other cell does, but it's also very electrically what do I want to say here? It's very excitable. So just like a nerve cell had a very special membrane that allowed ions to pass through and make it get excited and turn on or turn off, the sarcolemma is very similar in that it is also very susceptible to electrical impulses, just like a nerve cell. And so sarcolemma is a very important part of muscles in order to turn them on. Inside of that sarcolemma, we find the sarcoplasm, which is basically the cytoplasm of a muscle cell. Sarcoplasm contains a lot of really important things like sarcomeres, for example, which are what actually allow us to like have the contraction of the muscle. So it's a very specialized type of cytoplasm. Also inside of the muscle cell, we find this thing called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And of course, every time I say reticulum, you should be thinking net. And that's exactly what this is. It is a network inside of the sarcoplasm where we store calcium ions. And if you look at that picture at the very bottom there, you can see the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and it does have kind of a net-like structure to it. And this is super important because calcium is the trigger molecule of our muscles. It is what allows our muscles to contract. So we have to have a ton of calcium stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, otherwise our muscles can't function. The next part is called myoglobin. And myoglobin sounds very similar to hemoglobin, the prefix myo meaning muscle. So literally, this is like hemoglobin for your muscles. So myoglobin, it's a red oxygen storing pigment. And if you've ever seen raw meat and you've seen the meat and you're like, wow, that meat's all like bloody and nasty. Most of what you're seeing in that meat is not actually blood. Most of that red stuff you're seeing is myoglobin that's leaking out of the cells after the meat has been cut. And so myoglobin, it looks a lot like hemoglobin and it acts a lot like hemoglobin, but it's a different molecule. And basically, what happens is myoglobin is allowing us to store oxygen directly inside of the muscles so that the muscles can last a longer time without getting oxygen from the blood. So basically, the more endurance you have in a muscle, the more myoglobin you've built up inside of it. So once again, like when you're more in shape, your body's putting more myoglobin into those cells so that they can last longer. All right, myofibrils. These are the functional part of the muscle. So basically, every other part that we talked about up until now has been getting us up to the myofibril. That is the part that actually does the contraction. That's what does the movement and exerts all the force. So every other part of the muscle is basically supporting these myofibrils so that they can make the muscle do its job and move things. And then finally, we have this thing called a transverse tubule, or just for short, we're going to call it a T tubule. And these go through the middle of the cell. And so if you look at this diagram down at the bottom, you can see, if this doesn't get covered up, there's like a little pathway going through the middle of the cell called a T tubule, and it cuts transversely. It goes from top to bottom of the muscle cell and allows us to carry signals across the muscle fiber so that the whole thing can contract. Great. So here is a little picture, a little bit bigger picture. Once again, think pepperoni pizza, but this is showing us what a what a muscle fiber looks like. And so when we look inside the muscle fiber, I didn't mention this, but there's a lot of mitochondria. Of course, mitochondria being the powerhouse of the cell, we need to have a lot of energy produced inside of a muscle cell. So we have a lot of mitochondria. We have a few nuclei. And interesting little thing about the nucleus, we see several of them. I think there's three that I can count in this picture. And there's three nuclei because they actually fuse a bunch of smaller stem cells together to form these super long myofibrils, or sorry, to form these muscle fibers. And all of these nuclei are retained inside of the adult cell. So every muscle cell is kind of like a mega cell made of like many smaller cells that still keep their own nuclei. Great. So then, if you look at the inside of the cell, we do see some of that sarcoplasm is kind of like the fluid in between. But most of the cell is made up of those myofibrils because that's what does the actual work of the cell. So those are like the pepperoni in our pizza here, and we just have them like wall to wall. If you look in at one of those myofibrils, you can see that each one, and that's the picture below, each myofibril is surrounded by the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So it's wrapped up in this network of um, of just little tubes that carry calcium. And then inside all these little lines, all these little green and purple lines, those are the proteins that make up the muscle cell. So we always talk about like how if you want to grow your muscles, you want them to be strong, you have to have enough protein. Well, this is where the proteins are inside that myofibril. All right, and so that brings us to the physiology of muscle contraction. And when we look at the physiology of how muscles contract, the first thing we have to do is look a little bit closer at the equipment that actually does that contraction. And that brings us to this thing called the sarcomere. And the sarcomere, I have stated here, is the basic functional unit of a myofibril. So those myofibrils that are doing the business of the muscle and contracting are made of smaller units called sarcomeres. So each myofibril is made of many sarcomeres stuck together. So if we go back for a second and look at this previous picture, we can see here's our myofibril up here. So there's a whole bunch of these. And then each myofibril is made of one unit called a sarcomere. And so a sarcomere is kind of like this little region here in the center. There's another sarcomere next to it and another sarcomere on the other side. So basically we had just this continuous string of sarcomeres, one after the other. It's kind of like a polymer in chemistry. If you remember that like polymers were made up of single units called monomers and many monomers strung together to make these large polymers. That's what we see here. The sarcomere is the monomer of the myofibril polymer. Great. So if we look at a sarcomere, the sarcomeres are what cause the striation in striated muscles. So when we look at skeletal and cardiac muscles, the reason why they look striated or striped is because of these sarcomeres. And so let's go back and look at our picture again. Notice that There's some areas like where we see a lot of protein, it looks kind of dark, and other areas where there's not as much protein, it looks kind of light. So we have darker and lighter regions. Those form those striations. And if you look up here in this picture, you can see there's a darker region, a lighter region, a darker region, a lighter region. Those are the striations. Great. Now there's four parts that make up a sarcomere, and they have kind of weird names. The first part is called a Z disc, and the Z disc is like the end cap of the sarcomere, and it's shaped like a zigzag. Now, it actually gets its name from a German word, Zweichenscheibe. Wow. Okay. And apparently, Zeichenscheibe means washer in German because they thought that these are kind of like the end caps or like washers, kind of like, there's like nuts, bolts, and washers. That's what they thought they looked like. Great. And in between the Z discs at the end of the sarcomere, we have a couple regions called the A band, H zone, and I band. The A band, A stands for anisotropic. Wow. And apparently, anisotropic has to do with how it looks under the microscope. Basically, when you look at it, it looks dark. So the easy way I remember that is that the word dark, D-A-R-K, has an A in it. So dark A band is where we see the thick and thin filaments. So if we look at a sarcomere, so let's look at this one for a second, you can see where these thick filaments and these thin filaments are. Light would have a hard time kind of penetrating through here. So this is going to be the A band, where it's kind of hard to see through. If you look over here, because there's a lot of empty space and less protein, you can imagine it'd be easier for light to pierce through here under the microscope, and so it's going to look light. So we call that region the I band, where we only see the thin filament. So an easy way to remember that is the word light, L-I-G-H-T, has an I in it. So D-A-R-K, A band is dark, L-I-G-H-T, I band is light. Now, in the center of the A band is this area called the H zone, and that's where we see only thick filaments. So right in the center here, the very middle of this, there's just thick, not thick and thin, and that's called the H zone. H apparently is short for heller, which is German for the word brighter. And it's because this area is a little bit brighter. So in this spot right over here, you can see there's the thick and thin filaments, a lot of protein for light to go through. Here in the I band, very few proteins to go through. But here in the H zone, there's only thick, so it's a little bit easier to see. And so that's where we get all these names from. All right. So when we look at the sarcomere, we see it's made up of two types of filaments, thick and thin. And basically, these are the two different types of proteins that make up the proteins that make up the muscle. So the first ones are called the thick filaments, and they're made of this protein called myosin. And myosin is what actually does like the pulling or the contracting in the muscle. So this is kind of like the engine of your muscles. And myosin, if you look at it, I said it looks like two golf clubs twisted together. So let's go back for a second. Here in purple, these are the myosin. So we can see it's got two kind of heads like a golf club, and they're all twisted together. And then so you take a whole bunch of them, about 200 of them, and put them together, and you get a thick filament. And that's what makes up the center of the sarcomere. The other things are called the thin filaments, and they're made of this protein called actin. And that's these little green little things that look like olives. And each one of those little circles is a actin molecule, and they form into a helix that makes the thin filament. Great. So thin filaments are made of actin in a helix, and they have these things called tropomyosin and troponin. Tropomyosin is a blocker. It covers up the myosin binding sites. So if we go back for a second, we can see this very long strand is tropomyosin. And then connected to that is this little thing called troponin. And basically, tropomyosin covers up these little green dots that are called myosin binding sites. And you can see that up close here. So each one of these myosin binding sites is covered up by tropomyosin. Now, to me, I don't know what the prefix tropo means, but to me it means blocking, because the job of tropomyosin is to block myosin. It blocks myosin from connecting to actin. And basically, this is what allows your muscles to relax. Because if we go back for a second, myosin, like I said, looks like two golf clubs twisted together in parallel shafts, but they make these little things called cross bridges from their heads. So going back to the picture, all the heads stick out and form these things called cross bridges, where they stick out and want to connect, kind of like Velcro, onto the actin. The only reason why they don't do this all the time is because of tropomyosin blocking it. All right, well, that's a great place for us to stop today. The next time, we're going to go ahead and look and see what actually happens inside of these um, sarcomeres, and we're actually going to see how these things slide together and form muscle contractions. All right, well, thanks for listening, and have a great day.